Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of Life Along the Merrimack. This is a podcast that we have weekly for about a half hour. I am host Dyke Hendrickson. I am the outreach historian for the Custom House Maritime Museum. We talk about the history and health of the Merrimack River. Today we have a guest who knows quite a bit about the Merrimack River. She is Carrie Poirier, a former professor at Merrimack College. Welcome, Carrie.
Thank you very much.
Well, Carrie, everyone around here knows a little about the river, but you know quite a bit. And I wondered if I could ask you, how did the river fit into the coursework at Merrimack College? What did you teach at Merrimack, and how did it relate to the river and to the Merrimack Valley?
I had developed a course on urban history, and I took a very close look at mill towns and general planned cities. And so Lowell was a central part of that, and the city of Lawrence as well. So I worked on that. I worked the experience of these cities into an architecture course I did, and into just the survey of American history course as well. And I also did a seminar on Lawrence.
Lawrence itself was planned, was it not?
Right.
I mean,
it was a planned city. It was even more planned than Lowell was.
They had the mills figured out, and then they decided to build a town around the mills.
Right.
But in terms of regional history, where were you from, and did that have an effect on your interest?
I think it did. I was from Lowell. I was born and raised in Lowell. I think I was born literally about 100 yards away from the river. So and I've been following the river. I've been going downriver ever since. Made my way finally to Newburyport.
Well, my understanding that the river at certain times was quite polluted. Now, one of the things I think you have mentioned in your research and your classes is the way the mills came to the Merrimack Valley. I believe in the 1820s and 1830s, some very large mills were built in Lawrence and Lowell, and they hired a lot of people. They developed a lot of wealth, but they also polluted the river. Was that part of your growing up, that the Merrimack River was known to be somewhat polluted?
Yeah, it was. We're conscious of it because it also overlaps with polio epidemics. So there was a fear that somehow, pollution of the water might have been, something that fed into polio. There was fear over contamination of water, of the water supply, because the Merrimack was used as a source of drinking water. So there were always those concerns, and what textile production had cumulatively had as an effect on the river, dyes and other pollutants.
Were there environmental concerns at that time? I mean, you did mention a fear of polio, but nowadays, there are whole movements going on. And yet I read somewhere that one of the owners of, several of the mills said, well, the river might be polluted, but, that's part of developing capitalism. That's part of what we do here. Were people of the mill towns concerned about the environment per se, or was that not really on a list of things to do at that time?
I don't know much about whether or not the environment in general was a concern, but health. It was always health, at least from my perspective, my experience. And there were magazines in the early 1900s that discussed the high rate of typhus, and deaths related to the water. But I'm not sure. I think Americans had the experience of thinking we had endless reserves of natural resources, and you could just always move on, or that somehow whatever happened to the water, well, that all washed away seasonally. I'm not sure that there was that much of a concern nationally until the 1960s. Really?
Well, Lawrence still gets quite a bit of its drinking water from the Merrimack River, and as I understand it, there were some scientists, many years ago who actually used Lawrence as a testing case for how do we make river water cleaner to drink. And I think Lawrence was a leader in scientifically approaching drinking water.
I always get the names mixed up, but I think it was Charles T. Maine was one of the engineers working with the Essex Company that had built the city of Lawrence. And he conducted a number of experiments on purification of sewage and the drinking water, and he kept meticulous notes on what he used for filtration. And so out of that came the Lawrence Experiment Station that still exists.
Well, I believe there was activism in Lawrence in the early 20th century, but a lot of it was about wages. And as I recall, that one of the first labor strikes in America took place in Lawrence. Was labor and higher wages and better conditions, was that part of the Lowell and Lawrence experience as well?
Yes. Lowell, as early as the 1830s, had a strike of the mill girls, but they were largely demonstrations, and then later, of course, the strike of 1912 in Lawrence was very important because it was one of the few successful strikes.
I think that was called the Bread and Roses strike, and as I recall, well, I can't quite recall it, but
I hope not.
As I remember reading about it, some young people, children, were actually part of some of the demonstrations, and there was a phrase, "A little child shall lead them." So I think they got national attention for that.
They did, because the children, as well as many of the adult leaders, were brought to Washington, D.C. to testify before Congress. And President Taft's wife also attended the inquiries. So it gained a lot of attention, and it had an effect on shaming the mills, the owners of the mills, and put additional social pressure. And many of the children were testifying to the fact that they didn't have underwear. They were dressed in tatters, and consequently, here they are helping to make textiles, and they don't have decent clothing. So that went a long way to shaming into a resolution.
Well, both Lowell and Lawrence had a lot of immigrants, and I think the strike in Lawrence, one of the things that's remembered is many of the different ethnic groups actually came together and worked together. And as you know, there were Armenians and Irish and French Canadians and Italians and many different people.
Exactly.
But that must have been an example of working across ethnic lines.
Yeah, and that was one of the biggest problems, was to maintain solidarity, and ethnic differences were always being used as a wedge to try to break up the strike, and it wasn't successful. And the strike leaders were very concerned about that. They understood that's the wedge that would be used, and so every committee had representatives from each ethnic group in order to try to maintain that concept of solidarity.
I think, though, towards 1829, 1830, 1929 or 1930, there was another strike, and that was a little more violent. And I believe state police were brought in, and they were there for weeks, as a matter of fact.
Well, the same thing happened in 1912. So they had a strike in 1912, 1919. That was more confrontational. And then in the 1930s. But of course, strikes were very widespread in the 1930s with the creation of the CIO and the federal government beginning to be more solicitous of the concerns of labor. So there were big confrontations all around the country, also because of the economic crisis of the Great Depression.
That hit almost every city. I believe you're involved in the Custom House Maritime Museum from time to time, and you had a lecture not long ago on the ship, the Montana, which was built in Newburyport. And maybe you can talk a little about that. It does have ethnic overtones, but it's an intriguing little footnote in Newburyport history, the Montana.
There are two dimensions to it.
What year are we talking about, Carrie?
It was constructed in 1865, so the Civil War was just ending when it was constructed and when it was launched. And initially, the I'm not sure how it came about, but the decision was made either by the owners or whomever to put in place, other than the officers, an entire crew made up solely of African Americans. And the point was to make a demonstration of the fact that especially in the 1850s, black sailors were not hired because they traveled largely to southern states to pick up cotton. And it was required in the southern ports that African American sailors be jailed. And they could not be helpful to the offloading and onloading of the ships. And the captains had to pay room and board in the jails for their black sailors, so consequently they weren't being hired. And so with the Civil War over, something of a demonstration of goodwill, they hired an all-black crew out of Boston and New Bedford. And but then we don't know what happened after that. So they went off to Mobile, Alabama, and that's the last we hear of them. And my thrust when I was studying the Montana was to understand the circumstances of its final voyage back in 1872. So it had been on the seas for about 6 full years. And in 1871, the ship left Boston because it really sailed in and out of Boston, even though it was built here and owned here in Newburyport. And it left Boston in November of '71 with a load of ice for the Tudor Ice Company, and it was bound for Hong Kong. But go figure, because there was a tremendous profit margin in getting ice to China or to India, and to provide, for British and American expats in the area. A lot of money to be made in it, and on its way.
And this is before the Panama Canal, so it took quite a while
Well,
to
it
get
was
there.
Going east anyway, so it went around Africa. It didn't go over around South America, it went around Africa. And when it was well into the Indian Ocean, they realized that fire had caught in the cargo of ice. And they had to race to get to land so that they could get to safety. In the middle of the ocean, what do you do when you have a fire going? And they couldn't stop it. They didn't know the exact source of it, and they had 1,000 miles to cover until they would get to safety. So the race was on, and in about 6 days they made that 1,000 miles.
Really?
And then they offloaded what they had of their food and personal possessions, and then the ship just burst into flames and went down within a few hours of being there.
Now that is what I call an interesting local anecdote. Many different elements to a race element historically. Carrying ice halfway around the world is a remarkable element, and then catching fire and have to put on all the sail you could to get across. That must have been, an incredible moment.
Yeah, that's what drew me to the whole story.
Well, I also heard a very interesting local story. Just recently, there was a presentation at the Maritime Museum, and a young intern was talking about a scam that took place here in Newburyport about 1898 or so. And this group of people were selling shares to a company that purported that it could derive gold from water. And I think you were there, Carrie. Can you talk about this? I mean, the thing that amazed me, I kept wanting to say, not how stupid can you be, but how stupid can you be? But, a lot of people, and this investment of tens of thousands of dollars took place for this company that was going to derive gold from water.
Yeah, salt water. That's the element, I guess. That was the key. That you had to have salt in the water in order to produce it. And I know you look at these people and you think, how stupid could they be? But on the other hand, people are still at these scams. So how do you explain it? And remember, one of the people who had local connections was a minister. And so it was also presented as, well, an opportunity to, God's blessing on you. And so there was that element too, and people want to believe things.
Well, the thing that made me skeptical was all the scientific work was going on in Lubec, Maine. And this as many people know, was as far up the coast as you can go. It was actually a larger community then than it is now because it lost all of its 33 sardine plants over the years. But I kept thinking, it's not right in front of you. It's in Lubec, Maine, and no one's going to go to Lubec, Maine. But tens of thousands of dollars were generated, and then they became aware of something was wrong when these people disappeared. Just like one of the old westerns. Where are those guys? But they did have, quite a bit of attendance on that, and so several people, as you say, did raise the question of, scams go on today. This is going to be easy to do. It's easy money. There was a minister involved.
That's right. And just, I don't know, maybe about a month ago, I was watching Shark Tank, and one of the people who came in with one of his pitches was to make gold from thunder hitting the ocean. Thunder and lightning would turn water into gold. So, and obviously the sharks didn't fall for it, but that's a little odd. There's always somebody out there trying for something.
Well, I must say, on my point about Lubec, Maine, the illustration that this intern showed, and she had done some good, diligent work.
Yes,
and
she did.
This is all documented.
Yeah.
But she showed an illustration of what it looked like in Lubec, and you had several people were on the pier, and they were talking with the salesman, and they dropped this. It looked like a very large lobster trap.
Yes,
they dropped this down, and they evidently said, "Okay, let's wait." And so the illustration shows this person putting some small gold nuggets in.
Well, the people didn't see. The device being salted, whatever you want. I think seeded. I think you call it seeding it, trying to make it off as though there is gold being produced, but it's placed in there instead. And but that was the illustration. Of course, I don't know what people ended up seeing. The whole thing it's I don't know. I feel bad because then they blame the victims about it, but they were really even. I saw one of the articles that people had to read, and it was from a jeweler's magazine, talking up the process and not calling into question anything. And I would think a professional magazine might have had a question or two.
Well, there was also the remark somewhere in the presentation, do you believe everything you read in newspapers?
Right, exactly.
And of course, I started to get offended at that because I'm a career newspaper person.
There you go.
But then on the other hand, if you think that of all the foolishness that is printed, turns out not to be true, and we always used to say, sources say, or it is believed that.
Or they claim.
They claim. There are many ways. And now, just talking about the Maritime Museum again, I believe there's a pottery exhibition there.
Exactly.
Have you it's quite extensive, and maybe you could talk a little about that.
Well, I'm no expert, but when I had heard that they were planning it, I was all excited because back in graduate school, talking about working my way down the river, I had worked on a potter in Merrimack Port. Phineas Chase, and that is one of the potters who's featured. But of course, that was just a tiny little piece of what's part of a very important exhibit. The Bailey Company that operated in Newburyport is represented in its pottery in the exhibit. They borrowed from Historic New England, from the Historical Society of Old Newbury. They've contributed some pieces to the exhibit, Old Sturbridge Village. So it's a very important exhibit and very well done. And there's also a catalog for it. So there's some good information available about it.
Yeah, I'm just repeating, this will be here for several months. It's a pottery exhibition with a real local angle. Merrimack Port, for instance, and Newburyport, this area was quite prominent in making pottery. And if you're interested, they have, dozens of different examples of pottery, different sizes and colors and uses for it. And so another very large industry in the old days was brick making, wasn't it? Every time I drive past Lawrence and Lowell, I think, of course, of those large mill buildings, and they employed many, but just the bricks that created that was an enormous industry.
Exactly. A lot of, I'm not sure exactly where all the brick was produced. I know a lot of it was brought in from New Hampshire, but I'm not sure the details. But I'm thinking it was pretty good stuff because the first two buildings, classroom buildings at Merrimack, were built with used brick from when they demolished the mills in Lawrence. And so it looks like they're very old buildings because it's old brick, but it was all recycled from the old mills, from the old wood mill.
You know, we started talking about some of the pollution that's ongoing today, and of course it existed 2 centuries ago. But what was, my name is Dyke Hendrickson. I'm host of this podcast, Life Along the Merrimack. My guest is Carrie Poirier. And Carrie, you've been looking over the river for quite a while. What in the early 70s, the river quality improved. How did that come about? Because people ask that now, like, well, if we're getting more polluted, how did we improve in the 70s? What went right in the 70s?
Well, I'm not sure if I should categorize this as going right, but of course the mills were closing down. Mm-hmm. So many of the causes of the pollution would have disappeared, but I also think federal legislation would have also helped. Clean Air, Clean Water Acts that came out of the late 1960s were beginning to have an effect as well. And you could start, they talked about the ability to eat the fish that you might catch in the river as a result. I think more knowledge and investment in sewage treatment, sewage treatment plants made a big difference. But I think the legislation began to have an effect.
I think in those days, 2 New England senators, Senator Ed Muskie from Maine and Senator Ted Kennedy, of course, from Massachusetts, were instrumental in getting the Clean Water Act passed in 1972. There was also a Clean Air Act at that time, but it really helped the Merrimack River considerably.
I would think so, yes.
In terms of pictures of the old river and the Merrimack as what it looked like, I understand that the Museum of Old Newbury is also a great area for pictures. You're familiar with some of the things of the Museum of Old Newbury. Maybe you can talk a little about their collections. And I ask this selfishly because I'm going to be part of a group putting together a big photo exhibition at the Maritime Museum this spring. And so what is the collection like at the Museum of Old Newbury?
That museum, luckily, one thing that everybody might want to know about is that there is a website called Digital Commonwealth. And a year ago, at least a year ago, perhaps more, the Museum of Old Newbury submitted many of their photographs for digitization. And so anybody can go on Digital Commonwealth, enter Newburyport, or enter the name of a wharf or a business in Newburyport. And if there was something in the collection, it might show up right online, which is a really nice asset. But there is a wonderful, extensive photograph collection of portraits of people, houses, ships. It's a really extensive, collection that anybody has access to.
Well, that's good to know. As I say, I ask that kind of selfishly because I've got to learn these things. The other institution that you're involved with is the Newburyport Library. You volunteer in the archives occasionally. And I've always wondered, now the archives to the Newburyport Library is downstairs, and it's a great resource. But one of my questions is, what do people come looking for? Do they look for old photos or genealogy or out-of-print books? What do you think people are most taken by when they come there?
It varies, obviously, from person to person. For mainly what I had experienced were people interested in family history. And sometimes that also had to do with a business that the family may have run. I remember getting, I'm not sure, I can't remember the name of the bakery, but there was a bakery in town when I moved here. Around the Bartlett Cove area, around Route 1, as the bypass comes through town. And then a lot of people just trying to fill in their genealogy. But I know oftentimes business owners would call up for information, or individuals involved in a project, a research project, school children. But it is, I would say, it's the best local archive I've ever seen in a local library. It really is wonderful, and people can make use of many of the resources right from their homes. Obviously, they want to come in, but they can access the digitized local newspaper. There are maps that they can access from home by just simply going to the Newburyport Public Library Archives page, and they can see at the bottom of the page all the resources. And if they come in, they can use Ancestry.com, the library edition. There are a lot of resources there for them. But I don't think there's anything that you could name about local history that if you went into the archives, you wouldn't find something.
Well, I'm with Carrie Poirier, who is a retired professor from Merrimack College. And when you look over, your career in teaching and being in academia, well, what satisfactions did you get? I mean, I love history, but occasionally, you read history's not on the way out. We can't quite say that. But not as many young people are signing up. But just, as you take an overview, what did you really enjoy about history and teaching history?
I think I liked when I was able to get somebody interested in something. A lot of that whole thing about, about making fun about learning history, and then they built the pyramids, and then they, just like a chronology was something that often turned people off. One of the best times I ever had was in social history. I love doing the architecture course and social history, and I remember in one case, one of the projects I had the students do was a family history, or to pick one person in their family and to do that, recreate that person's life through documents as a learning exercise of bringing a lot of things together. And years later, after one of my students had graduated, he sent me a note that the person he had chosen, his grandfather, had died, and he thought to himself, when this was going on, that he found at the bottom of his closet, he actually found what he had put together for his grandfather, all the photographs, everything, and then suddenly he was the hero in the family because he had this, and he thanked me. He'd sent me an email thanking me. He'd hated the project when he did it, didn't see the point of it, and then all of a sudden it all came together for him, and that type of thing was the type of satisfying.
Very rewarding.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just bringing us up to date. We talked a lot about history of the river today, the pollution. It's still a great river. It's still a lot of recreation. I went to an event yesterday of the Merrimack River Commission, and a group of 60 to 70 local, state, and federal leaders are coming up with solutions to increase pollution. So they have okayed $50,000 to keep the commission in business. They've okayed $100,000 at the state level to have a warning system, so when there's sewage discharges upriver, then those of us downriver in Newburyport can hear about it, either online or through flagging. So things are working out. As you have brought out, there was pollution 2 centuries ago. It improved in the 70s and 80s. It's getting a little worse now, but a lot's being done about it. So I think that's the modern angle to that. So I want to thank you, Carrie, for being on the show. We're, about just a few seconds away. But what are you reading these days? I always ask people what they're reading. And do you have any histories underway?
I'm terrible because I don't sit and read a book because I'm always doing research. So I mine books for certain details.
What is
and
your research?
I've been working on ships and maritime history. So I've been putting together a pretty good collection about maritime history and on American-Chinese relationships.
Wow.
Going back because of Caleb Cushing.
Caleb Cushing, yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. You're a wonderful guest, very knowledgeable. The story about the Montana in terms of ships and shipbuilding was just great. So this is Dyke Hendrickson, host of Life Along the Merrimack. I had Carrie Poirier today, an expert on local history, and we'll be here again next week to talk about life on the Merrimack and the history and health of the Merrimack River. Thank you.